You locked the bunker door yourself, then handed them the cyanide. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep. I'm glad you made it through another day. If this quietly cursed little channel helps you rest and brings even a little calm to your busy life, then our efforts are worth every second it takes to make these daily videos. So please like, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you over there. Your support goes a long way, and our appreciation for that is more than you could know. Tonight you marry your mistress, shoot yourself in the head and leave your most devoted followers to burn your body while Berlin falls to ashes. Close your eyes. The room is still. The fire crackles softly beside you. You lie still, breathing slowly beneath warm sheets, the weight of silence pressing gently into your chest. Your muscles loosen, your thoughts go quiet. There is no movement now but the slow tug of sleep, and the memory you've tried not to remember. Below the ruins, beneath the trembling ceiling, candlelight flickers against concrete. The air smells of gunpowder and perfume. Dust hangs like smoke. Your boots are polished, your pistol is loaded, and your guests are waiting. Outside, the city burns. Inside, the plan is already in motion. Good evening, and welcome to another soothing journey through history's most delightfully catastrophic moments. Tonight, we're visiting Germany in early 1945, where the curtain is finally falling on what was supposed to be a 1,000-year Reich. Spoiler alert, it lasted 12 years. Mathematics was never the Nazis' strong suit. Picture, if you will, a country that has spent 6 years rearranging Europe's furniture and is now discovering that the neighbours would very much like their things back. Allied troops are pouring across Germany's borders like water through a broken dam, except the water is armed and extremely irritated. The Western Allies have crossed the Rhine, which Hitler had confidently declared would never happen. The Soviets are steamrolling through the East with the enthusiasm of people who have some rather pointed questions about the last few years. German cities that once bustled with imperial confidence now resemble elaborate archaeological digs, except the archaeologists are still running for their lives. Villages that had stood for centuries become geographical footnotes in the span of an afternoon. Roads that once carried victory parades now host very different processions. Lines of refugees, deserters, and the occasional Nazi official, desperately practicing their "I was just following orders" speeches in regional dialects they hope sound more innocent. And yet, in the depths of his Berlin bunker, Adolf Hitler maintains that everything is going according to plan. Because obviously, when your capital is surrounded, your armies are in full retreat, and your closest allies are quietly shopping for new flags, that's exactly when you reveal your master strategy. The Führer spends his days moving little wooden blocks around maps, commanding divisions that exist only in his increasingly colourful imagination. His generals nod along with the enthusiasm of people who have already burned their uniforms and memorised their new identities. The trains still run. Sort of. Berlin's stations have become gathering points for a fascinating collection of humanity. The genuinely deluded, who still believe victory is imminent, the pragmatically terrified who are trying to get as far from Berlin as geography will allow, and the completely bewildered, who keep asking when the next train to 1939 departs. Platform announcements are made in the universal language of chaos, and the only schedule anyone follows is whenever something with wheels shows up. Meanwhile, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a bunker that was supposed to be a temporary refuge, Hitler's inner circle has settled into what can only be described as the world's most expensive group therapy session. The mood, remarkably, manages to be worse than that of people actively losing a war. Goebbels still delivers daily pep talks to whoever hasn't fled yet, his voice echoing through concrete corridors like the world's most sinister motivational speaker. Eva Braun practices her smile in a mirror, the same smile she'll wear when she takes her final bow. And Hitler? He shuffles through his papers like a bureaucrat filing for eternity, his moustache twitching with each new report of catastrophe. Every command that emerges from this subterranean theatre of the absurd arrives either too late to matter or too impossible to execute. Often, both. Orders are given to armies that no longer exist, to defend cities that are already flying white flags, to execute strategies that would have been ambitious in 1942 and are now simply adorable. The staff, those brave souls who haven't yet discovered urgent business elsewhere, spend their time nodding gravely and then quietly pocketing whatever isn't nailed down, because when empire collapses, apparently the first casualty is the sugar supply. The Thousand-Year Reich, it turns out, ends not with the dramatic crescendo its architects had imagined, but with the peculiar anticlimax of bureaucrats stealing condiments. History, as always, has a sense of humour that its participants rarely appreciate, and as the walls close in around the bunker, as the sound of artillery grows closer and the excuses grow thinner, one can't help but admire the absolute commitment to denial. It takes real dedication to maintain optimism, while your life's work crumbles around you with the structural integrity of wet cardboard. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's watch as the Soviets approach Berlin with all the subtlety of an avalanche, while the Nazi leadership continues to dine and deny with remarkable consistency. As 1945 stumbles towards spring, the Red Army approaches Berlin with the methodical enthusiasm of people who have travelled a very long way to attend a very overdue appointment. They bring with them tanks, artillery, and approximately 4 years' worth of accumulated grievances. The Soviets have crossed Poland, smashed through East Prussia, and are now knocking on Berlin's door with the persistence of debt collectors armed with heavy ordnance. One might expect this approaching tsunami of Soviet steel to inspire some sense of urgency among the Nazi leadership. One would be wrong. Instead, the inner circle responds to the crisis with all the adaptive intelligence of a tea party on the Titanic. Hermann Goering, the Reich Marshal who has spent the war years collecting art and expanding his waistline in roughly equal measure, is nowhere near Berlin. He's holed up in his Bavarian estate, busy curating his post-war wardrobe and practicing his surrender poses. Because when the Reich is collapsing, nothing says leadership quite like a strategic retreat to one's wine cellar. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of genocide who has somehow convinced himself he might be a reasonable negotiating partner, is conducting secret peace talks with the Allies. He approaches these negotiations with all the self-awareness of a serial killer offering marriage counselling. Himmler seems genuinely surprised that the Allies aren't interested in his ideas for a kinder, gentler post-Nazi Europe. His proposals are received with all the enthusiasm typically reserved for food poisoning, and yet he persists, like a salesman who refuses to acknowledge that no one wants to buy his particular brand of horror. Back in the bunker, Hitler continues his daily routine of commanding phantom armies and rearranging imaginary furniture. His staff meetings have taken on the surreal quality of performance art, with grown men nodding solemnly as their leader explains how the war will be won by divisions that exist only in his increasingly abstract relationship with reality. The generals, those who haven't yet discovered urgent business in South America, sit through these briefings with the glazed expressions of people watching their careers die in real time. Outside, Berlin prepares for siege with all the organised efficiency of a fire drill conducted in a foreign language. The city's remaining civilians, those too old, too young, or too stubborn to flee, dig trenches with whatever tools they can find. Spoons become shovels, kitchen knives become weapons, and hope becomes a luxury no one can afford. The Volkssturm, Hitler's last-ditch militia composed primarily of teenage boys and men old enough to remember better wars, are issued Panzerfausts and pointed toward the approaching Soviet armour. It's less of a military strategy and more of a tragic costume party where everyone's dressed as cannon fodder. The boys, some still young enough to believe in fairy tales, are told they can stop tank divisions with handheld rockets and patriotic fervour. Their training consists largely of being shown which end of the weapon points away from them and being reminded that retreat is treason. It's the kind of military preparation that would be hilarious if it weren't so thoroughly horrifying. These children, who should be worrying about homework and bicycles, are instead expected to halt the Red Army with equipment that works best when used as expensive fireworks. Meanwhile, the Soviet artillery begins its patient work of turning Berlin's suburbs into abstract art installations. Buildings that have stood since the Kaiser's time discover they were never designed to withstand the attention of Stalin's gunners. Streets become obstacle courses, parks become landing zones, and the careful urban planning of centuries becomes a study in creative demolition. The sound of approaching warfare echoes through the city like a thunderstorm that refuses to break, building tension with each passing hour. In the government buildings still standing, the remaining Nazi officials conduct the last bureaucratic rituals of the Reich. Memos are still written, though no one reads them. Meetings are still held, though fewer people attend each day. Orders are still issued, though their primary function seems to be providing kindling for the increasingly common fires that warm hands no longer sure they belong to citizens of a functioning state. The paperwork of empire continues even as the empire itself dissolves, because apparently the German commitment to documentation extends even unto apocalypse. Somewhere in this chaos, a secretary is still typing reports, a clerk is still filing forms, an accountant is still balancing books that will never be audited. They continue these tasks with the dedication of people who have discovered that routine provides the only anchor in a world that has lost its moorings. Because, when everything else fails, at least one can ensure the filing system remains alphabetical. The irony, of course, is that all this meticulous record-keeping will soon provide excellent evidence for war crimes tribunals. The Nazis, in their obsessive attention to detail, have documented their own demise with the thoroughness of academics writing their own obituaries. History will thank them for their diligence, though perhaps not in the way they had hoped. Deep beneath Berlin, in a concrete tomb that smells of damp desperation and overcooked vegetables, the final act of the Nazi drama unfolds with all the theatrical flair of a community theatre production of Hamlet, performed by people who have forgotten most of their lines. The Führer bunker, Hitler's subterranean sanctuary, has become less of a command centre and more of a very expensive suicide club, with pretensions of statesmanship. The bunker's atmosphere could charitably be described as festive, if one's definition of festive includes the aroma of fear sweat, the sound of muffled explosions, and the sight of grown men practicing their death faces in mirrors. The staff move through corridors with the purposeful urgency of people who have run out of purposes but refuse to admit it. Conversations are conducted in whispers, not for security but because no one wants to be the person who accidentally says something optimistic and has to explain where that came from. In a burst of romantic inspiration that speaks either to love's triumph over adversity or to the human capacity for timing mishaps, Hitler decides that now is the perfect moment to marry Eva Braun. The ceremony is planned with all the joy typically associated with root canal surgery. The guest list is remarkably short, consisting primarily of people who are either too loyal, too terrified, or too deranged to leave. The wedding cake is whatever's left in the bunker's pantry, which at this point consists largely of hope and expired canned goods. The bride practices her smile, while the groom practices his final speech. Both activities occur with the same grim determination one might bring to any other unpleasant but necessary task. Eva's wedding dress is whatever she can find that isn't stained with the general apocalypse, and Hitler's formal wear consists of his usual uniform, now accessorized with the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has discovered that reality has a sense of humor he doesn't appreciate. The wedding ceremony itself is conducted with all the romance of a business merger between failing companies. Vows are exchanged in voices that suggest both parties are reading from scripts they didn't write and don't entirely understand. The officiant, a Berlin city councillor who has been conscripted for this duty, performs the service with the enthusiasm of someone calculating whether performing one last wedding will improve his post-war employment prospects. Witnesses sign documents with hands that shake from either emotion or the increasingly proximate sound of artillery fire. Toasts are made with whatever alcohol remains in the bunker, which at this point is largely medicinal spirits, and whatever Goebbels has been using to preserve his voice for his final radio broadcasts. The wedding guests, a collection of generals, secretaries, and true believers who have somehow missed all the obvious exit cues, raise their glasses with smiles that suggest they're all sharing the same very dark inside joke. Someone attempts a speech about eternal love, but the words are drowned out by the sound of Berlin being systematically disassembled overhead. The honeymoon consists of Hitler dictating his political testament, while Eva reads magazines that are already historical documents. Romance apparently takes many forms, and in the depths of a doomed bunker, it manifests as a shared commitment to going down with a ship that was never seaworthy to begin with. The newlyweds spend their brief married life discussing the most efficient methods of suicide, which is either very modern or very medieval, depending on one's perspective. And then, with the timing of a Swiss watch operated by someone having a nervous breakdown, the testing begins. Blondie, Hitler's German shepherd and arguably the most innocent resident of the bunker, becomes the unfortunate subject of cyanide experiments. The dog, who has spent the war loyally ignoring her owner's increasingly erratic behavior, discovers too late that loyalty has its disadvantages. The poison works exactly as advertised, which everyone finds either reassuring or deeply disturbing, depending on their immediate plans. The final scene unfolds with all the dramatic tension of people who have rehearsed their deaths more thoroughly than most actors rehearse their lines. Hitler and Eva retire to their private quarters, where they conclude their marriage with a joint suicide that manages to be both deeply tragic and somehow anticlimactic. The gunshot is muffled by concrete walls and the general noise of a city being conquered, making it less of a dramatic finale and more of a quiet period at the end of a very long, very violent sentence. The remaining staff, upon discovering that their leader has taken his final bow, respond with the mixed emotions of people who have suddenly found themselves unemployed during the apocalypse. Some weep, some panic, and some begin quietly discussing whether anyone knows how to operate the ventilation system, because the smell of gasoline and burnt flesh is becoming quite noticeable. Joseph Goebbels, not to be outdone in the melodrama department and having apparently decided that suicide is a competitive sport, makes his own final arrangements. With the systematic thoroughness that has characterized his entire career, he murders his 6 children before joining his wife in what they clearly believe is a grand romantic gesture, but which history will remember as simply the logical conclusion of choosing to follow a madman into madness. By morning, the bunker has become a tomb with surprisingly good ventilation and extremely poor feng shui. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years has ended in a basement, surrounded by the smell of diesel fuel and the quiet weeping of people who have suddenly realized they're going to have to explain their resumes to new management. With the bunker now serving as an impromptu mausoleum and Berlin's streets echoing with the sound of Russian being spoken with authority, one might assume that Germany would surrender with the promptness of people who have suddenly discovered they've been backing the wrong horse for 6 years. One would, as usual, be giving humanity far too much credit for common sense. The death of Hitler creates a power vacuum that is immediately filled by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, a man whose primary qualification for leading Germany appears to be that he wasn't in the bunker when it became a crematorium. Dönitz assumes the title of Reich President, which at this point is roughly equivalent to being named captain of a sinking ship after the previous captain has jumped overboard, taken the lifeboats, and set fire to the deck chairs for good measure. Dönitz approaches his new role with the optimism of someone who believes that careful paperwork can somehow undo 6 years of comprehensive international relations disasters. He establishes a new government in Flensburg, near the Danish border, where he and his cabinet spend their brief tenure trying to negotiate surrender terms as if they have something other than unconditional defeat to offer. It's rather like watching someone try to bargain with gravity while falling off a cliff. Impressive for its persistence, less so for its practical applications. The Admiral's government exists in a strange diplomatic twilight zone, where they're simultaneously the legitimate government of Germany and a collection of war criminals that everyone is trying to figure out whether to arrest immediately or wait until after the paperwork is completed. Dönitz sends envoys to negotiate with the Allies, who receive these ambassadors with all the enthusiasm typically reserved for tax auditors bearing bad news. The conversations go roughly as one might expect when one side wants to discuss terms and the other side's primary interest is in discussing the location of the nearest prison cells. Meanwhile, Hermann Goering, who has spent the last weeks of the war perfecting his impression of a man who was never involved in any of this unfortunate business, surrenders himself to the Americans, with the theatrical flair of a celebrity checking into an exclusive resort. He arrives with luggage, staff, and an apparently sincere belief that he'll be treated as a fellow professional soldier, rather than as someone who has spent the last 6 years enthusiastically participating in history's largest organized crime spree. Goering's surrender is conducted with all the dignity one can muster, while wearing a uniform that's been tailored to accommodate both ego and extensive dietary indulgence. He shakes hands with American officers, smiles for photographers, and generally behaves as if this is all a minor diplomatic misunderstanding that will surely be cleared up once everyone has had a chance to review his very reasonable explanations for everything. The Americans, to their credit, manage to maintain straight faces while accepting the surrender of a man who seems genuinely surprised that there might be consequences for his actions. Across Germany, the Wehrmacht discovers that surrendering an army is surprisingly complicated when that army is scattered across several countries, speaking different languages, and operating under the general assumption that the war ended sometime last week, but no one sent a memo. Units surrender to whoever happens to be nearby and armed, leading to the surreal spectacle of German generals offering their swords to bemused American lieutenants who are more interested in finding someone who speaks German and can explain where they've hidden all the good wine. Local German officials, those who haven't fled to South America or discovered urgent family business in neutral countries, find themselves in the awkward position of surrendering towns to Allied forces, who are often more organized than the people doing the surrendering. Mayors present keys to cities that no longer have locks. Police chiefs offer to maintain order in communities where order is being maintained by foreign soldiers with better equipment and clearer objectives. The Americans, being Americans, accept these surrenders with the methodical efficiency of people who have read the manual and are determined to follow proper procedures, even when those procedures seem to have been written by someone who never expected to actually have to surrender an entire country. Towns are occupied, flags are changed, and paperwork is filed, with the dedication of people who believe that proper documentation is the foundation of civilization. The Soviets, approaching surrender negotiations with the enthusiasm of people who have some very specific ideas about what constitutes adequate compensation for the last 4 years, are less interested in keys and ceremonies and more interested in ensuring that everyone involved understands exactly who won this war and what that means for the immediate future. Their approach to accepting surrender tends to involve fewer handshakes and more pointed questions about where various people have been spending their time lately. German soldiers, discovering that they are no longer soldiers but rather displaced persons in urgent need of new career plans, begin the long process of walking home, assuming they can remember where home is and whether it's still there. Roads fill with men carrying whatever they can salvage from their military careers, heading toward horizons that may or may not include familiar landmarks, family members, or functioning governments capable of explaining what happens next. And yet, despite this obvious collapse of everything resembling German military resistance, the actual, formal, legally binding surrender remains frustratingly elusive. Because apparently, even when everyone agrees the war is over, someone still has to figure out who has the authority to sign the papers, which papers need to be signed, and whether the pens work properly. The formal end of World War II in Europe unfolds with all the bureaucratic elegance of a post office trying to process the mail while the building burns down around them. What should be a simple matter, Germany has lost, everyone agrees. Germany has lost, Germany especially agrees, Germany has lost, becomes instead a masterpiece of diplomatic complications that would be impressive if they weren't happening while people are still dying. On May 7, 1945, in a schoolhouse in Reims that has been hastily converted into a centre for international relations, General Alfred Jodl arrives to surrender Germany to the Western Allies. The ceremony has all the pomp and circumstance one can muster when the main venue is a repurposed classroom and the guest of honour represents a government that no longer effectively governs anything. Jodl, representing Donit's government in name only, signs documents that formally end the European war while sitting in a chair that probably once held French schoolchildren learning arithmetic. The Western Allies are delighted. Photographers capture the moment for posterity, hands are shaken, and everyone congratulates themselves on successfully ending fascism before dinner time. The surrender is unconditional, comprehensive, and legally binding, which should settle matters quite nicely. The Americans and British prepare to announce victory, plan parades, and begin the complex process of transitioning from winning a war to winning a peace. There's just one small problem. The Soviets weren't invited to the party. Stalin, upon learning that the war has apparently ended without his explicit permission, responds with the patient fury of someone who has spent 4 years fighting Germany and would very much like to be consulted before Germany stops being fought. The Soviet position is simple and reasonable. If there's going to be a surrender ceremony, it should probably include the people who spent the last year systematically demolishing the German army and are currently occupying the German capital. The Western Allies, suddenly realizing that they may have committed a diplomatic faux pas roughly equivalent to planning someone's funeral without inviting their next of kin, hastily agree that perhaps another surrender ceremony might be in order, because apparently the only thing more complicated than ending a world war is ending it twice to make sure everyone's feelings are properly acknowledged. Stalin insists on a do-over, but with proper Soviet participation and all the theatrical grandeur that such a momentous occasion deserves. The location chosen is Berlin, which has the advantages of being geographically convenient for the Red Army, and symbolically appropriate, as the former capital of the Reich, that is now being unreiched through proper legal channels. For 2 days, the world exists in the peculiar state of having ended World War II but not quite officially enough for everyone involved. The war is simultaneously over and not over, depending on which ceremony one chooses to recognize. German soldiers, learning of the Rheims surrender, begin laying down their weapons and heading home, only to discover that they might still be at war, depending on how one interprets international law and Soviet sensibilities. Meanwhile, the surviving Nazi leadership spends these 2 days in the strange limbo of people who have surrendered, but aren't quite sure to whom. Dönitz and his government continue to exist in Flensburg, issuing orders to no one in particular and maintaining the bureaucratic fiction that they still represent something that could charitably be called a state. They're rather like the crew of a ship that has already sunk, but hasn't quite finished sinking, still performing their duties while standing in chest-deep water. On May 8th, or May 9, depending on one's relationship with time zones and political sensitivities, the surrender ceremony is repeated in Berlin with all the Soviet grandeur that the occasion demands. Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, representing what's left of German military authority, signs the surrender documents again, this time in front of Soviet officials, who want to make absolutely certain that everyone understands exactly who won this war and who gets to dictate the terms of what comes next. The ceremony is conducted with the solemn dignity appropriate to ending the most destructive conflict in human history, combined with the subtle awkwardness of people who are all pretending this is the first time they've done this. Speeches are made in multiple languages, documents are signed with multiple pens, and photographs are taken by multiple photographers, all to ensure that the historical record will show that the war ended properly, with appropriate consultation of all interested parties. The Berlin surrender includes representatives from all 4 major Allied powers, transforming the occasion from a bilateral arrangement into a genuine international production. The British, Americans, French and Soviets all witnessed the German signature, creating a surrender that is unconditional, comprehensive, legally binding, and properly witnessed by everyone who spent the last 6 years making it necessary. Keitel signs the documents with the resignation of someone who has discovered that losing a world war involves significantly more paperwork than he had anticipated. His signature formally ends the Third Reich, dissolves the German armed forces, and initiates the complex process of converting a fascist state into whatever comes after fascist states, when their neighbours have run out of patience for their political experiments. And so, after 6 years of war, millions of deaths and more destruction than Europe had seen since the Mongols decided to redecorate, World War II in Europe ends not with one dramatic flourish, but with 2, conducted by the same people, signing the same documents in different buildings to satisfy the diplomatic sensibilities of allies who agree on everything except the proper way to accept a surrender. The war is over. Again, for the second time in 3 days. Perhaps the third time, depending on how one counts. Mathematics, as we've established, was never the strong suit of anyone involved in this particular conflict. By the middle of May 1945, Germany has achieved something remarkable. It has become completely, thoroughly, and undeniably quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of Sunday mornings or library reading rooms, but the exhausted quiet of people who have spent 6 years screaming and have finally run out of breath. It's the silence that follows when empires finish collapsing and the dust settles on what used to be called the 1,000-Year Reich, which managed to last roughly 1% of its advertised duration. The cities that once echoed with jackboots and propaganda now echo with the more practical sounds of people digging through rubble looking for anything useful. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich and Dresden have been transformed into archaeological sites where the archaeology is still smouldering. Buildings that survived Napoleon and Bismarck have discovered they were not, in fact, built to withstand the sustained attention of Allied bombers and Soviet artillery. Urban planning, it turns out, becomes significantly more flexible when most of the urban part has been reduced to its component elements. Children play games in the ruins, their toys now consisting of helmets that still smell of fear and metal fragments that used to be part of vehicles with more ambitious travel plans. They build forts out of what used to be government buildings and use bomb craters as swimming pools once the water stops being quite so intensely flavoured with destruction. These children, who will grow up to become the next generation of Germans, are learning geography by navigating around unexploded ordnance and studying history by living in its immediate aftermath. The adults, those who survived the war and its various enthusiasms, begin the long process of pretending they were never particularly interested in politics anyway. Suddenly, no one can remember being especially supportive of the Nazi Party. Former true believers discover urgent need to discuss their previous careers in terms that emphasize their clerical rather than ideological contributions. "I was just keeping records" becomes the most popular phrase in Germany, followed closely by "I never actually agreed with any of that." The Allied occupation forces arrive to discover that governing a defeated country is significantly more complicated than defeating it. The Americans bring chocolate, democracy, and an instruction manual that assumes the people being democratized will be more cooperative than they turn out to be. The British bring tea, administrative expertise, and the quiet confidence of people who have spent centuries practicing the art of explaining to other nations how they should run their affairs. The French bring wine, philosophical discussions about the nature of liberty, and a distinctly personal interest in ensuring that their German neighbours understand the importance of being good neighbours going forward. The Soviets bring vodka, industrial equipment that used to belong to Germany, and a very clear vision of what German redemption should look like, expressed primarily through the medium of reparations and political re-education. Their approach to occupation combines the efficiency of people who have very specific ideas about justice with the patience of people who plan to stay until those ideas are fully implemented. Meanwhile, across Europe, displaced persons begin the complex process of figuring out where they belong in a world that has been thoroughly rearranged. Millions of people who spent the war being moved around against their will now have the opportunity to move around voluntarily, assuming they can remember where they started and whether anyone they knew is still there. The roads fill with families carrying everything they own, heading toward homes that may no longer exist, in search of relatives who may no longer be alive, in countries that may no longer be called what they used to be called. The Allies hold meetings in buildings that are still standing, dividing Germany like a cake that no one particularly wants, but everyone agrees must be sliced fairly. Maps are drawn, zones are established, and the complex process begins of teaching democracy to people who have spent the last 12 years being taught that democracy is a weakness that leads to confusion and inefficiency. The irony that this lesson is being delivered by the countries that just won a world war through democratic decision-making is lost on no one, though it's considered impolite to mention it during the orientation sessions. In the fields around the ruined cities, farmers plant potatoes with the dedication of people who have learned that political ideologies are significantly less nourishing than root vegetables. The soil, enriched by ash and the organic contributions of a collapsed empire, proves surprisingly fertile. Life, as it tends to do, begins the patient work of growing back through the cracks in the concrete, one potato at a time. The future smells faintly of canned meat and the lingering ideological residue of a political experiment that ended badly. But it also smells of soap, which suggests that people are beginning to believe they might have a future worth being clean for. Children who spent the war years learning to identify aircraft by their engine sounds now have the opportunity to learn more peaceful subjects, like mathematics that doesn't involve calculating bomb trajectories, and geography that doesn't change every few months when borders get redrawn. Somewhere in the quiet, someone begins sweeping up the ash, not because they believe they can sweep it all away, but because sweeping is something one does when one believes that tomorrow might be worth having a clean floor for. It's a small gesture, hardly noticeable in the grand scope of European reconstruction, but it suggests that people are beginning to plan for tomorrows that extend beyond mere survival. The Thousand-Year Reich, that grand experiment in racial superiority and continental reorganization, ends not with the dramatic finale its architects had envisioned, but with the mundane reality of people cleaning up after a very expensive party that got completely out of hand. The guests have gone home, the music has stopped, and someone has to deal with the wreckage. And so Germany begins the long, slow work of becoming something other than what it had been, not because of sudden moral revelation or dramatic political conversion, but because the alternative, continuing to be Nazi Germany, is no longer available as a lifestyle choice. History has moved on, taking with it the comfortable certainties of empire and leaving behind the more complex challenges of peace. The war is over, the Reich is finished, the cleanup can begin. Sleep well. Tomorrow someone will continue sweeping. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.